Welcome to Random Movie Reviews. I'm Nathan, and today I'll be talking about The Blob. Well, I'm really excited to talk about this one. The Blob, the 1988 remake. We'll talk a little bit about the Steve McQueen original. This film in particular has gone on to become one of my favorite horror movies. I first saw it back in late 2020 during the pandemic, which is rather fitting for those who have seen the movie. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And it was one of those movies where after I finished it, I was just like, where has this movie been all my life? Because it felt like it was just tailor-made for me. It kind of hits all of the notes that I like in horror, especially 80s horror movies. And it strikes that perfect balance of being fun, of being scary, exciting, adventurous, even funny at times, but the humor never undercuts the sincerity or the seriousness of the dramatic elements in the story. It was just so well done. And to this day, I mean, I know this movie has generated a little bit of a cult following, not quite to the same level as the other two big 80s horror movie remakes, such as The Thing and The Fly. In fact, there are some horror fans out there, me being one of them, that say that The Fly, The Thing, and The Blob are kind of like the holy trinity of 80s horror movie remakes. And they all have a lot of things in common, but the most specific thing that they have in common is that they take a B movie from the 1950s and they remake it, but they make it better. They basically take movies that were flawed but had really strong premises, and they just build on that with better characters, better effects, better horror elements, and so much so that The Thing and The Fly in particular are movies that are seen as being even better than the original film, and I would say the exact same thing for The Blob. Unlike The Thing and The Fly, I haven't seen the original versions of either of those films, and I think I'm going to be changing that this October. I'll do kind of like a back-to-back while watching the original and then watching the remake. But I have seen the original The Blob, and I saw it after I saw this movie. I remember it was streaming on HBO Max. I'm like, oh, well, I love the 80s one. Let's check out the original one. And it's pretty boring, not that scary, and not like... I mean, it's bad, but not like in a funny bad way, because it was kind of too dull and drab. And there's some unintentional laughs because the Blob in that movie looks like a piece of Jell-O, and it's just not threatening or scary. But here's the thing. I love a good 50s B movie. In fact, one of my favorites of that era is a movie called Them. That movie's still fantastic and a lot of fun. And sure, it's kind of cheesy and dated, but it's not boring. But The Blob is like... The Blob is just not a good movie. It just isn't. Sorry, fans of the original The Blob. I just don't see any entertaining stuff in that movie, quite frankly. But the idea of like an alien or unknown substance, this gelatinous substance that just absorbs anything in its path, becoming a even bigger monstrosity, I'm like, that's a scary idea. And so it's like the director of this movie, Chuck Russell, who would go on to direct one of my childhood favorite films, The Mask, and would also direct my favorite Nightmare on Elm Street film. Frank Darabont, who is most famous for his Stephen King adaptations such as Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile. He also co-wrote the script of Dream Warriors, and him and Chuck Russell reunite again for this movie. They both wrote the script and Chuck Russell directed it. And basically the idea is like, what if the Blob was actually scary? And that's what this movie is. And it's not just that the original version of the movie like isn't scary, like a lot of 50s horror movies are just not scary, but it's also the fact that none of the characters are really interesting. The movie doesn't really feel like it has any genuine stakes. There's no tension, there's no suspense. There's really nothing to grab onto other than the fact that it's kind of mildly amusing that these people are afraid of this little Jell-O looking thing. And so The Blob, in my opinion, is one of the greatest, not just horror remakes, but one of the greatest remakes ever, because it's what most remakes should be. I think in theory, films that should be remade are films that have good premises, but just kind of fumbled the execution or just hasn't withstood the test of time. And when you look at modern movies, in modern remakes, most of the films that Hollywood chooses to remake are films that never really needed to be remade, and films that were already kind of perfect already. One of the biggest ones that comes to mind is RoboCop. RoboCop's one of my all-time favorite movies. They remade that. Why? And they did nothing. They took out all of the elements that made RoboCop a masterpiece. They took out all the satire, they took out all the gratuitous violence and all that stuff and turned it into like a PG-13 lame-ass superhero action movie. It's like, nobody wanted that. And that's a remake that nobody talks about. It's completely fallen off the face of the earth. I'm sure some people are like, oh yeah, there was a RoboCop remake, wasn't there? There was also a Total Recall remake. There was a fucking Point Break remake. And then you fast forward to like all the Disney shit, which they're still remaking all these classic movies, usually movies that were animated, like Mulan, and now very infamously Snow White, and they're remaking them and they're just making them worse. They're not doing anything to improve on the source material. They're not doing anything to update it, because you don't need to update Snow White. You don't need to update Mulan. Those movies still work perfectly fine as wonderful animation adventure films for kids. They're still great. You're doing nothing but kind of tarnishing their legacy, quite frankly. But unlike those movies, the remake of The Blob took the premise that both Chuck Russell and Frank Darabont thought, we could make this scary. We can do something with this that is way better than the original movie. And that is exactly what they did. There's so much about this movie that is just fantastic, outside of all of the practical effects, which are still awesome. I mean, there are some moments here and there where it looks a little cheesy, but honestly, it doesn't even bother me so much, because so much of the practical effects in this movie hold up, and it's all revolved around characters that I actually like. Like Kevin Dillon's character, for example, who plays Brian Flagg, who's kind of like this outsider, bad boy kind of archetype, and the town looks down on him, except for a few members of the community, like the mechanic who runs the snow machine, which ends up being very crucial in the third act, and the owner of the diner. But he's a character that's seen as kind of a shady, kind of criminal almost character, and the movie focuses on him as being kind of the anti-hero who can, be the heroic character that he didn't know he could be. And that's just a really satisfying character arc, and you get nothing like that in the original movie. And then you have Shawnee Smith, who plays Meg Penny, who's the cheerleader, kind of homecoming queen gal. And after her date, who is the captain of the football team, Paul Taylor, after he dies and gets horribly consumed by the Blob, which we're going to talk about the horror elements of this movie in a little bit, she has to team up with Flagg, and they kind of have a little bit of a romance, but the movie doesn't push that too far. It's mainly just like these two characters, these two archetypes that you don't normally see kind of pair up in these kinds of movies. You see them do it here, and they have this great chemistry with one another. You see the characters grow. You see them having to depend on one another to get out of this insanely absurd, ridiculous situation, and you end up really caring about the characters. And if I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. A monster movie, which that's what The Blob is, it's essentially a monster movie, is only as good as its victims. And if you don't like the victims, if you can't sympathize with them, if you can't connect with them on some sort of level, then there's little to no suspense. And if there's one thing that this movie really excels at, it's amazing suspense. There are so many nail-biting scenes in this movie that to this day is still just an absolute joy to watch. There's the scene where the owner of the diner, that sweet lady who's super nice to Kevin Dillon, she runs to the phone booth after we see the horrific incident of the cook at the diner being fucking pulled in to a sink. And exploding blood, and that giant blob comes out and tries to kill him. We see the diner lady go into the phone booth, and then it's like the blob is just like sliding down and it's gonna crush the phone booth, and it's like, oh my god, it's such a horrifying and suspenseful scene. And then there's the whole scene in the tunnel where Meg rescues her brother and her brother's friend from the movie theater, and they have to go in the sewers. And this movie does one of the things that you don't see a lot of horror movies do, and it kills a kid. And not only does it kill a kid, it kills the kid horrifically. Like, he's melting, and it's horrific. And I know I know there's some people that's like, that kind of crosses the line. You don't want to see kids die in movies, and I get it. But I think the reason that scene is important and really effective is that it highlights the fact that this blob, it's not even a creature. It's just like a substance that's just mindlessly consuming things. It doesn't care whether it's a kid he's absorbing, whether it's a dickhead movie theater audience member, whether it's a football star. It's just like whatever's in its path, it's going to consume. And it really just ups the stakes significantly that it's like, it's not going to cherry pick whether it's women, children, men, doesn't matter. I'm a giant blob thing that absorbs organic matter. And if you're in my way, you're getting absorbed and digested horrifically. And so it raises the stakes, and it feels necessary. That scene feels necessary to me to really show the genuine horror of the blob. And this movie is a tight 95 minutes, and not a single second is wasted. There's not one moment in this movie that feels unnecessary or too bloated. I mean, honestly, Hollywood, you need to start bringing back 90 to 95 minute runtime movies. Not every movie needs to be well over 2 hours. Watching The Blob, 95 minutes, you're in and out, and it tells a complete story, a story with characters that you like, a story that has incredibly memorable scenes of horrific, gooey, goopy violence. And there's a good balance of humor. The movie has light moments that kind of bring down the stress levels, and then it has super intense moments that ramps it back up, and it kind of is like a roller coaster. Who wouldn't want that in their horror movies? And I just love this movie. I could just keep going on and on. I mean, this movie, it gives you your money's worth, and it's so shocking that this film still hasn't really gotten its due. Quite frankly, the movie didn't do well at the box office, which I don't understand why, because this really feels like a quintessential popcorn kind of movie where it's like, it's not super deep. I mean, the movie does touch on anti-authoritarian themes of like the government and organized religion. That's actually one of my favorite aspects of the movie. Any movie that portrays the government as being, something not to be trusted, that is right up my alley. Same with organized religion. The movie kind of ends on the cliffhanger of the priest character that we see early on, him wanting to create his own Armageddon because he sees himself as a messiah figure, and so he takes the little pieces of the blob, and we get that little sequel tease that we never really got. And I don't want a sequel to this, by the way. I love that little ambiguous ending that kind of ends on that twisted note. I think it just adds to the enjoyment of the overall movie. But yeah, I can keep talking about this movie, so I think I'll just stop right there. For those who have seen this movie, what are your thoughts? Do you think it's as good as The Fly or The Thing? I think it's almost to that level. I don't think this movie is aged quite as amazingly as The Thing in particular. That movie still, there's not a whole lot of moments in that movie that looks kind of cheap. There are some moments in The Blob where some special effects don't look as great as others, but for the most part, I don't even care because it's all so awesome. Even the cheap stuff, I enjoy it. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this movie? Do you like it? Do you love it? Tell me what you think in the comments below. And as always, thank you guys for watching.